Good morning, everyone. If everyone could start taking their seats, we can get started. We'll start in about a minute. Okay, good morning, everyone. Everyone was so responsive. You got quiet so quickly. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Joe Ruffalo. I'm the general manager for The Hill. We'd like to thank everyone for coming this morning, both in person and online, for our event today, Nuclear Frontier, Securing America's Energy Future. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Nuclear Company, for hosting and sponsoring this important conversation. We're here today because America's energy future is shining a little brighter after the recent passage of the bipartisan Advance Act to bolster U.S. nuclear power production. The new law seeks to broaden how America generates power, creating a more resilient infrastructure to meet the surging energy demands driven by data centers, electric vehicles, and reshored factories. Of course, the law isn't without critics or competition. Concerns have been raised about potential safety issues and challenges related to nuclear waste. On the flip side, there are those who worry that the newest law doesn't go nearly far enough to match China's 27 nuclear reactors currently under development. The question now is, where do we go from here? But before we get underway, just a few housekeeping issues. If you are in the room, please silence your phones, but we do encourage you to join online in the conversation there. You can follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram at The Hill using the hashtag #TheHillEnergy. And with that, I'm delighted to introduce our first segment featuring our very own Bob Cusack, the editor-in-chief of The Hill. He's joined by special guest, the Honorable Mark Menzies, former Deputy Secretary of Energy and the current President and Chief Executive Officer of the United States Energy Association. Welcome.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for everyone who's come this morning. Mark, you've worked in the energy sector for 3 decades.
Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, well, I've been here 3 decades too. So, private sector, law, lobbying, as well as within government. What have you learned from those experiences and applied to your current role?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it's great to be here with you, Bob, and thank you for having me. And it's great to see so many former colleagues and friends in the audience. And it truly is remarkable to me to see this enthusiasm at this time of the morning on the topic of energy. So that is one thing that I learned, is that energy is very important, and it certainly drives all the economies. And we know that on the global stage, countries need energy for their independence and, of course, their security and economic prosperity. So we realize that here in the U.S., but also globally. So that's been a hallmark. People tend to forget that energy really provides almost all of the needs, that we have as people. So that's why it's so dynamic. That's why this room is probably filled this morning. And I've learned different things when you're on the Hill. You do have to put together policies that, as we see sort of in the pending permitting bill, things everybody doesn't get everything. So the art of developing energy policy, is that you get rooms full of smart people like we have here today, get their views, get their inputs, and try to help drive policy. I think Maria's going to talk about a success story on that when she talks about, the recently enacted nuclear legislation.
What are your current priorities, and specifically as it relates to talk about international challenges, specifically China?
Yeah, well, that's another great question that you have. And China is really is driving so much in the world today with its huge demand. We know that on the climate stage, their emissions can certainly offset all of the reductions of all the countries, certainly offset the U.S. emissions. Their demand is important. Their innovation is important. Their production levels are important. We import a lot of their products. And yet, it's important that we in America be able to develop our supply chains. I think an important lesson learned out of COVID is that you have to have your own independent supply chains, because while globalization served its purposes, I've been around a long time, I know the globalization efforts, we thought that that would really help make the globe smaller. We could outsource a lot. We could be a bigger community. Trade would be important. It'd minimize, the chances of wars, all of that. And yet what we've seen is when you look in the energy space, we've outsourced a lot of our the energy needs that we have, both in production and importantly, the supply chains. And it took something like COVID to wake up and to say, wow, how independent are we? And all countries ask that question. So you see that going around globally, which is now why I think that the role for USEA, just to get around to the question that you asked, our mission is today what it was 100 years ago when we were actually established. We were established as part of the World Energy Council, which at that time saw a need to ensure that there was going to be global access to energy so that all countries could have access to it, it could be affordable, and it could be, back then, reliable. And that mission continues today. And when you look forward in the energy space, you see for the future, we're looking at all of these emission reduction plans, and they kind of run out to 2050. But when you look out to 2100, by 2050, we're going to have another, according to the UN, another billion people in the world, and possibly by 2100, another billion. So an additional 2 billion people on Earth, and they will all demand energy. It's coming from, the developing countries in Southeast Asia and India and parts of Africa. USEA is in all those places. And so we are trying to bring access to energy. We're trying to have their electricity systems independent from Russia. We're in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. So these are our mission is what we do today.
What are the biggest challenges facing the industry?
It continues to be permitting. I'll be honest. It's, we're an organization that supports all of the above. And whether you're looking at building renewables in the developing Southeast Asia countries, or whether or not you're building infrastructure to carry natural gas pipeline to replace coal someplace, it all takes infrastructure. And it doesn't really matter what it is because everything is local, and it might impact the way the local community operates. It might impact view sheds. It changes the way of life. So permitting, whether it's in the United States or frankly any country. And when I joined USEA, I asked our seasoned veterans, I said, well, what lessons have you learned that you'd like to impart to me? And they said, you have to get community buy-in from everything that we do. You can't, as U.S., you can't show up in a developing country or any country, and same thing in the United States. You can't show up and say, we have a great energy project for you, and it's going to really help you solve your problems. And they're burning biomass, inside of, their homes, and you can see the health effects. But for them, they have been doing this for generations. Mm-hmm. And they don't know any other thing. And traditions are developed around that. That's their lifestyle. And it's been around. So you can't go in and go, here's a great propane tank. And by the way, we've got the infrastructure just to get them off of burning dung and biomass. But you've got to build capacity. You've got to convince them. You've got to change their way of life for generations. That's the challenge. And again, so that continues to be, frankly, the biggest problem.
Many energy issues are not bipartisan, and the ADVANCE Act did not get a lot of headlines. The Hill wrote about it, but it wasn't like on the front page of the Washington Post. That was a bipartisan bill signed into law by President Biden. Talk about the bipartisan aspect, because that seems to be increasing. As Joe mentioned, there are always going to be critics of any legislation, but overwhelmingly bipartisan bill. Where do you see that trend going and helping the industry?
That's a great question. And again, we've seen the bipartisanship come together with the IIJA and with, back to the Competes Act and the ADVANCE Act. So bipartisanship is still possible. It may not be I wouldn't say, nothing is easy on the Hill, but back in 2005, many people know I was associated with the Energy Policy Act back then. There was an opportunity really to kind of go to the center. So now we see issues have to come together, like, let's just say, with nuclear, for example. There are way more supporters of nuclear now than there were back in the day when people thought about, 3 Mile Island, and then Fukushima happened, and that kind of thing. But today, with the increase in demand and with Sam Altman's quip, about we need more electricity to power AI that we're all going to be dependent on, and throws out fusion, and you see capital flowing. Capital is not partisan. Capital flowing into private companies to develop fusion. And that ties in with, while at DOE you're developing these technologies, fusion had always been in the science office, not in the nuclear energy office. That's how much of it was, sort of always 30 years out. But today there's genuine enthusiasm. We've made some breakthroughs in that area, building SMRs. These are bipartisan issues, I think. And so as a consequence, you've seen really important legislation that came up. I talked about permitting. That also applies to the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so there have been policy changes there with hopes that we can sort of improve the process that it takes to get a combined operating license, to get the health and safety standards established. The rest of the world actually looks to the standards set by the NRC when they look to embrace SMR technology or existing nuclear technology. There's a lot of excitement overseas about AP1000 to be built. I learned this morning of the genuine enthusiasm and plans that we can build in the United States additional AP1000s. I had the pleasure and privilege to go to the Vogtle inauguration ceremony along with Secretary Grenholm, former Secretary Ernie Moniz, former Secretary Dan Bruyette, a couple of former deputy secretaries. This has taken decades to get that AP1000 built, but it was a celebratory event. It was truly celebratory, and it was bipartisan, and I think that we were able to really celebrate American ingenuity and, frankly, commitment to build this plant. And without it, we wouldn't be having this discussion about the enthusiasm of SMRs and potential fusion, and again, more AP1000s.
We have some questions from the audience. My colleague Lisa will read them off. She has a couple. Here is she.
This one comes from Chris McNair. How are the industry inclusion efforts coming along for public-private partnerships?
How are the what's coming along?
Can you repeat it one more time?
Oh, there we go. Chris McNair asked, how are the industry inclusion efforts coming along for public-private partnerships?
Public-private partnerships.
Right. Are we talking about like a DOE, Department of Energy, public-private partnerships, right? Well, there's been a huge effort to develop that. That is a hallmark of how Department of Energy operates, and I think that there have been many efforts. Anybody who talks to Chiga Shah in the LPO office or any of the heads of any of those agencies over there, they talk about public-private partnerships. That has been a tried and proven method of advancing technologies and getting capital to invest in projects and get the department or the government to really take the technological risk. Which is, I think, the important role for a government to play. So you enable the finance to move if the government can take the technological risk, it seems to me. So I think they're kind of racing, if you will, to try to formalize things and get it out. Somebody said we're in an election year. So, your last year of potentially last year of your first presidential term, you tend to try to push things forward. So I think you're seeing things come out there.
Wait, one more?
You touched on this a little bit already, but Martin Perlmutter asked if we could elaborate. How do you change the climate of public opinion on nuclear energy?
Yeah, so, Maria will come behind me, and I think she'll tell you, but when I was at the department, nuclear was very important. We had a lot of enthusiasm for nuclear, and our motto, or we came up with this. We wanted to make cool nuclear. We wanted to make nuclear cool again, as in cool, hip, and global. We have excellent centers of excellence around at the universities. We were going around trying to engender true enthusiasm for engineers to go into nuclear, that there was a bright future for nuclear. And with the emissions story, IEA, back in 2019, I think, wrote a report that says if you are serious in reducing global emissions and providing independent energy to countries, all countries should be looking at investing in nuclear now. While it's capital intensive, you have to understand that these, and I'm sure everybody in this room understands this, but maybe there's somebody out there watching, the investment today, these nuclear facilities have operating licenses 20, 40 years, and they can be renewed. And so for what you're investing in nuclear today, think about this, 60 years from now, maybe even 80 years from now, they are still operating, and imagine the cost coming down, and it's all emission-free. And with the safety developments today, the new technologies that don't use light water reactor or pressure water reactors, the molten salts, the pebble bed reactors, et cetera, you literally are having walk-away safe potential nuclear. You have improvements in the accident-tolerant fuels, for example. So safety is only going up, not going down, in my opinion. And so there's a real genuine enthusiasm for that.
You mentioned it's an election year, 96 days to go. And if you look at, thinking back to the 2000 election, a lot of the analysis back then was, well, with Bush or Gore, it really is not going to matter that much. Their policies are very the same. And that, whether that was true or not, but now moving forward, since then, radically different views of energy. You were a Trump appointee, got 79 votes in the Senate, very impressive. But what would the election mean for the future of energy and nuclear in both directions?
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is, both recognize the importance of energy, first of all. So there will be a lot of efforts to make sure that we continue to provide affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy everywhere. I think the biggest difference is probably the recognition that geopolitics has changed in large part because of the shale revolution, which allowed certain states to proceed with hydraulic fracturing, and we had cheap abundance natural gas, and we could hydraulically frack oil. And so as a consequence of that, just since the 2005 Act, for example, when those issues were addressed, the U.S. has become the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas, the world's leading producer and the world's leading exporter of natural gas. Now that has really changed geopolitics, okay? So a Trump administration will likely recognize that. It's not that the current administration doesn't, but the importance of having the U.S. maintain that position. Now, I think both recognize the importance of emission reductions, and there's a lot of technology about carbon capture, technology, carbon capture storage, and direct air capture. There's, increased efficiencies in industrial technologies, et cetera. But I think that's going to be the key. You'll just see barriers removed to that development. But it's not to say there won't be continued efforts to have, emissions being reduced. And so in the climate world, it's emissions that cause climate. It's not really the fuel you use. So if we can get a hand on the emission reductions, and the U.S., by the way, has shown that it can. We can grow and we can reduce. I go around the world telling people you should emulate the United States and its policies if you want to have a vibrant energy industry and yet reduce emissions. You can do that. Now, again, you brought up China. A lot of what we do is offset by what China does and India to another extent. But I think we have the opportunities, to get in there and really help drive down emissions. So I think the policies will be a lot like they were in the past Trump administration, and I think those would, if he gets elected, I think you'll see a lot of that.
Last question, you mentioned the demand for energy and electricity, AI, of course. Where are we headed with the future of nuclear over the next 5 to 10 years? And where would you like the industry to be?
Yeah, well, of course, when you think of nuclear, you think the the power sector, right? I mean, energy is also in transportation and industrial sectors. But that thermal heat that nukes provide, think about, the future hydrogen economy, for example, right? I mean, in the IRA, you have the first time 45V, clean hydrogen tax credit. Nuclear can, produce emission-free power that, we hope can, be used to produce hydrogen. So when you think globally and other opportunities for nuclear, the future is very bright.
Well, we've run out of time. Please thank Mark Menzies for joining us this morning. Thanks so much, Mark. Appreciate it.
We've now come to the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Please welcome back to the stage Joe Ruffalo, General Manager of the Hill, in conversation with Julianne Edwards, Chief Development Officer at the Nuclear Company. But first, a quick video from our sponsor.
The landscape of American energy is transforming, propelled by the electrification of everything and the rapid development of artificial intelligence. These industrial advancements are driving an unprecedented surge in baseload electricity demand. Industrial electricity consumption alone is expected to increase over 200 terawatt hours by 2030, the equivalent of powering nearly 20 million homes. This explosive growth poses significant challenges for our energy infrastructure, exacerbated by the planned decommissioning of over 70% of existing coal plants by 2030. America needs to reinvest in nuclear power, a robust, efficient source of baseload generation with a capacity factor of over 92%. Despite the immense benefits of nuclear power, the United States has completed the construction of 2 new nuclear reactors in the last 20 years. From 1960 to 1980, over 100. Without a comprehensive plan in place to scale up this crucial energy source, the U.S. has no clear path to support the unprecedented industrial growth facing our nation. The gap between our baseload power and our needs is widening daily. Meeting the soaring energy dependencies of modern life could become an impossibility. Luckily, all that's about to change.
Well, Julianne, thank you so much for being here today. We just heard a little more about the changes that have in the past and what is coming up. So why is it important for the U.S. to remain a leader in nuclear power?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here. And I still get goosebumps when we watch that video. We've watched it across the country now in our 6-state tour on the bus that you guys saw outside when you were coming in, the Nuclear Frontier. What I've gathered from my 6-state journey and landing here in D.C. in our capital is it drives our global economy. We are the largest economy in the world, and for us to maintain that, we have to invest in nuclear power. It touches every fabric of our lives, from STEM education to driving technologies, also onshoring of manufacturing, and just head of household jobs. And so nuclear energy to me is like where we all need to be driving our attention to.
So we've seen there's clear bipartisan support for nuclear power. With the government being so supportive, why aren't we building more reactors?
It's a great question. We should be building a ton of them. It's a large capital-intensive investment to make. And I would say that it's difficult to bear that risk and go to your shareholders and your investors and say that you want to make this investment without bipartisan support, without policies that's going to enable you to have that investment return. And we're seeing steps in that direction. But I also believe that we need to be thinking differently about how we place that investment on the shoulders of the utilities in certain markets. So that's what the Nuclear Company here is to really solve for. Form those public-private partnerships, ensure that we have a coalition of members that not only bear the risk, but also gain the value over that 60-year term that we just heard about.
Could you tell us a little more about your business model and what you're really doing to address some of these issues?
Absolutely. So the Nuclear Company was incorporated over a year ago, and we're so excited to be here with you guys today. Our focus is on fleet-scale nuclear, and what that truly means is we're not focused on one site, one project, and one jurisdiction. We're focused on making sure that we bring nuclear across the country in multiple states, multiple markets, both unregulated and regulated. And I think when I look at others that are innovating in this space, a lot of folks are focused on the technology itself, and I believe that's roughly 12% to 15% of the capital investment of nuclear. We're focused on the balance of that, making sure that folks are getting that level of certainty to invest in manufacturing and expanding their facilities, investments in developing workforce and increasing proficiencies in the trades, and also in technical degrees that we're seeing like nuclear engineering and materials engineering. And so we're really hopeful that this momentum will drive the conversation to talk not just at a single entity and a single site, but to think on a global and fleet scale approach.
Speaking of global, we talked at the beginning that there's 27 nuclear reactors being built in China and none in the United States. Could you talk a little more about the impact that would have on national security?
Absolutely. I was just in Nucor's headquarters this week in Charlotte, North Carolina. Their CEO, Leon, was very kind to host us. And well, one thing that he mentioned to the audience was just the cost of electricity. And when I kind of do my own research and look at what we're seeing in terms of publications, you know, the cost of energy in China today is roughly 7 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. In the US, we're roughly 16 to 25 cents per kilowatt hour. So we're extremely high. Their investment in nuclear is driving their price down. We're actually going to see that they're going to be below 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And with that, it's going to drive manufacturing and jobs and, honestly, education to that country. And we cannot lose our global presence, and we cannot lose our leadership role in this country. We proved in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that we could build fleet-scale nuclear. I believe after we flipped the switch and commercially operated our first facility in Pennsylvania and Shippingport, there was an order of 200 reactors across the country, and we built a little over 100. Today, we've got 93 reactors operating today. So we have an incumbency. We actually have a very safe track record. We've proven that we can operate these things efficiently. And so because of that, we need to protect that incumbency, make sure we continue to invest in the safe operations of those reactors. But we cannot lose our foothold to another country. It's so important, and I believe you're going to see a video shortly about that.
Could you tell us how the nuclear company is working with other organizations and other experts to advance nuclear technology right now?
Yeah, so part of our tour was actually, one of my favorite parts was to Georgia Tech. They're a university that has a huge investment in engineering program. And I would say we're going to start with education, making sure that we understand these younger minds are just so innovative, and they've been exposed to enormous amounts of information just with the advancements of AI, advancements of social media platforms. So they're looking to innovate the way we look at radiation protection. We're also met with various members of the trade facilities and organizations across the country, and they have great innovations on how they could really increase productivity in the field. So we're going to make sure we partner with those folks. And then the manufacturing associations that exist, and all of the folks that have protected that incumbency and contributed to the safe operations of our nuclear fleet, like the Nucors of the world, and making sure that we leverage their lessons learned. We talked about Vogtle earlier, and putting that into the fleet scale deployment.
You mentioned the tour, just one last question.
Yeah.
If you could tell us a little more about that and what you hope to accomplish.
Oh, wow. I've been on the road for 2 weeks. I have a great
Glad
husband.
you made it up.
Yeah. He's been very patient with me. I'm looking forward to going home and sleeping for a couple of days. But it was an amazing tour. We learned so much, and really it was to just really inform and educate. And what I have learned is it's bipartisan here in the Capitol, but it's bipartisan everywhere. I am seeing folks at gas stations wondering if our bus was nuclear powered, and I had to make sure they realized it was not nuclear powered. But they were very, very excited. They all wanted to get a picture, and I think there was a hashtag I touched the bus, and so it was really fun. But we learned so much, and I hope that we also inform the general public about what our mission is and how excited we are to bring American jobs back. Just because we cannot lose to a country that is, making those steps and not procrastinating. We cannot procrastinate as a country. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for the important discussion. We're now going to watch a second video.
In the last few years, China has become the global leader in renewable energy, and they are on track to dominate the nuclear energy landscape next. With 56 reactors operating and 27 more under construction, China's nuclear expansion is set to eclipse the United States by 2030. In 1980, China had 0 reactors, the US over 100. Since then, American development has stagnated while China expanded its fleet at speeds the world had never seen. China has plans to nearly triple nuclear capacity by 2035. For the US to match, it would take about $360 billion and more than a decade of construction just to keep up. China plans to lead the global economy, and it's starting by leading the clean energy transition. With 0 reactors currently under construction, the U.S. risks losing its prominence in setting global industry standards.
Thanks again to the Nuclear Company for their support of today's program. Now please welcome Raphael Bernal, reporter at The Hill, joined by our panel of experts, Maria Korsnick, CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, Leslie Jantarasamy, Managing Director of the Energy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Stephen Ezel, Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation.
All right. Well, thank you and welcome. And let's just jump straight in. Maria, I want to start with you. So the ADVANCE Act that passes, it's got bipartisan support, very few votes against. But we know that passing the bill is usually the first step, not the goal. How are you going to measure success with the ADVANCE Act and, the first steps towards success?
Well, the ADVANCE Act is really about helping to bring efficiency to regulation, so I think it's a great direction. Part of bringing success to that is watching the regulator and see if we see evidence of that efficiency building. We've actually been working with the regulator for many years, talking about the fact that there's the need for efficiency. And actually, we're hearing and seeing some good behavior. So we want to make sure that that continues. The fact that it's in the ADVANCE Act and it created some conversation on the Hill also means that the oversight process, and there's oversight of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on the Hill, and that's a good opportunity as well for them to ask questions and hear directly from the regulator that there are improvements. But I would add, the efficiency of the regulator is important, but think about the conversations that you just heard, right? This is a tremendous opportunity for nuclear, but we got to get going. We got to get going. And I don't want to take your thunder because I'm sure you're going to ask us a lot of those questions. But my point is I don't want to dump that all on the regulator. The regulator's a piece of it, but there's a lot more to that picture that we got to pull together.
Leslie, I want to get a little bit on this, on the bipartisanship, and yes, we will get to all those points. I mean, it's no secret what political climate we live in. Nuclear has traditionally been something that it wouldn't be very hard to fearmonger around nuclear, yet politicians have clearly decided not to do that. Where do you think this kumbaya bipartisanship comes from on this particular issue?
Yeah, and I do want to recognize that this event has already said the word bipartisan quite a bit. So you're really speaking my language. So really, really happy to hear that. I think that there's a lot going on today in recognition of the fact that we are moving towards modernizing our economy, towards building a new energy economy that's built, needs to be centered around clean energy, and that nuclear, is a foundational piece of that portfolio. And so I think members of both parties are really looking to nuclear as a way to build on decades of innovation that we've been doing in the technological space around nuclear to enhance our economic competitiveness around the world, and to also create this new opportunity to build new gigawatt scale clean energy facilities in the United States. It's difficult, as we've heard earlier, to permit new energy facilities, and so when we're thinking about the trade-offs between the different types of technologies and ways of creating and generating clean electricity, nuclear power kind of steps into that conversation in a big way, because there are so many reasons why, because of the kind of ability of nuclear energy to have that high capacity factor to generate lots of clean megawatt hours onto the grid, that there's a lot of benefits that this technology brings that are being recognized across both parties.
And the other word we've heard a lot today is China. And I think we're going to keep hearing about that. But Stephen, so hearing that word a lot, I was thinking about the last time you had two superpowers. Well, back then it was superpowers, now it's major powers, competing for nuclear dominance. Russian technology of the 20th century doesn't have the best reputation. Is China's current nuclear development a parallel of what we saw in the Soviet Union in the 20th century?
Well, thanks for the invitation to be here. No, actually, I think it's entirely different. We released a report in June called How Innovative is China in Nuclear Power? And what we found is that China probably stands 10 to 15 years ahead of the United States in the deployment of fourth-generation nuclear reactors. That's the new stuff. Even talking what's happened over the past 2 decades is staggering. China has tripled its nuclear power production in the past 10 years. It's built as much nuclear power in the past 10 years as America did in the previous 40. And as we heard, it intends to build 150 total reactors between 2020 and 2035, both of the CAP 1000, as well as their new sets of fourth-generation reactors coming online. The Shijiawan-1 was the world's first fully operationally deployed fourth-generation reactor. They just received approval in the Linglang-1 for the world's first IAEA-approved SMR design. So we're behind, and we have serious catch-up to do. This is a much different competitor than the Soviet threat we faced during the Cold War.
Let me ask a quick follow-up to segue into the regulatory side. What regulatory advantages does China have that we don't have?
Well, one of the biggest, as I understand, is that 60% of the levelized cost of electricity in nuclear is capital. And state-directed Chinese banks have provided 70% of capital at a rate of 1.4%. So just on the financing side alone, they go in with a massive advantage, let alone the fact that at the direction of the state government, because any Chinese company is by definition an organ of the state, whether you're an SOE or a de facto private company. But when the CCP says jump in a direction, they do so. And so they are able to get agglomeration effects and coordinate entire ecosystems to go make things happen.
So, Maria, that segue to regulatory. One thing Mark said earlier, he said the biggest challenge is permitting, which sounds familiar in energy in general. Is there low-hanging fruit in the regulatory system that could be changed without sacrificing security or safety and environmental concerns?
Sure, and I guess, really the question I think we need to ask ourselves is, how do we need to get going, right? The United States needs to get to build. Hearing what China's doing, that's great. China uses a lot of energy. We're happy that they're getting some clean energy out of that. I think the challenge we need to ask ourselves is, do you want to see Chinese reactors around the world? Do you want to see Russian reactors around the world? Because that's what they're trying to do. It's not just that they're building, it's that they're building the supply chain. And while they're building that supply chain, they're going to then turn it to other countries around the world. Africa looks pretty interesting. China and Russia have sort of divvied that up to figure out who wants to build what reactors where. We need to figure out where we want to be 20, 30 years from now. And is that the world that we want to live in? Because if it isn't, then we need to do something about that now. And to get U.S. technology other places around the world and to help our allies, you got to build it here first. You need the showroom floor. Are you going to go out and buy a car you've never seen before? No, you're going to go look at some. You might want to drive it. You might want to look at it. That's what we got to do. We got to build here in the United States. And his question is, well, then why aren't we? What's making it hard? What's making it hard is it's very capital intensive on the upfront. So we need those public-private partnerships. We need to be creative. The hard stuff, which is innovation, we're damn good at that. We're really good at innovation. Our national labs have been working on this stuff for over decades. That innovation pipeline is full. It's ready to come out. What we need is to get that partnership between the government, between the private sector, between the utilities, and manage that upfront risk and get going.
Leslie, let's stick on that side of innovation. To achieve those goals, to achieve the puzzle piece in electric generation that is nuclear as we want it, is there one technology that stands out over the other? Keeping up the Gen 3 reactors, making more Gen 4, making more modular reactors. Like, is there one leading edge there?
So I think the point was made earlier also that we need to continue to invest in our existing fleet of nuclear reactors. They really provide the backbone of the clean electricity in this country, around 20% for the past, couple of decades. And so, continuing to operate those safely and reliably is hugely important. At the same time, the point around innovation really is that we have this opportunity to invest in kind of the next wave of different types of reactors. And I think, we'll see the market kind of shake out on which technology kind of leads in that effort. And I think that there are different use cases for the different technologies. Perhaps small modular reactors, has been discussed that they have this unique ability to help support electricity demand in the industrial sector and the manufacturing sector. AP1000s are, huge important players in providing that baseload electricity, the kind of always on and reliable sources of clean energy. And so, there are different, reasons why we would like to see the suite of advanced reactor technologies take off in this country. And I do want to build on Maria's point about risk, that it's really, we're seeing a lot of folks express interest. A lot of utilities are, really looking to these types of modern and innovative technologies as what they would like to see in the future. But they're not necessarily going to want to be the first ones out of the gate. It's the first of a kind conundrum here where, they want to see someone else kind of build one first and learn from that. And also, when we have first of a kind technologies being deployed, we see the cost, and the learnings from that deployment, in the next wave of builds, from that. And so I think that we really are a little bit in the chicken and egg situation where we would like to see more and more deployment, but there's a lot of difficulty in who wants to be first out of the gate.
On that point on innovation, if China is ahead of us, what are their most exciting innovations, and can we take lessons of what we should do or what they've done right or wrong?
Well, it's interesting that the Generation 4 International Forum, which is a group of countries that have defined the 6 different types broadly of 4th-generation nuclear reactors. There are 6 of them, and China is currently building all 6. And part of the reason why they're doing so is they're experimenting, right? They're looking at these technologies, they're seeing which can be developed cost efficiently, throwing lots of things at the wall, and they'll down select, the path to go forward. I just released a report on electric vehicles as a brief side point. In 1985, China manufactured 5,200 electric vehicles. This year will be 27 million, 21% of global production. They have over 200 electric vehicle companies operating in China. Now, why? Well, because they're throwing a lot against the wall. They're going to down select to which companies are most effective and come up with the most innovative products. So I do think they're pursuing a different kind of innovation method than me might necessarily be doing so in the United States. But I think your point is the key. The whole of government, the system, the coordination approach. I mean, the DOE has laid out a plan to triple American nuclear energy production by 2050. They've also pointed out that we're going to have 375,000 more skilled technicians and engineers across the country to make that happen. So public-private partnerships to bring together the technology and the people to make this happen are critical. But one other point. In 1985, it took the U.S. Food and Drug Administration 3 years to make the safety and efficacy determination for any new drug in the United States. But through regulatory reform, particularly through PDUFA, we've gotten that down to where the FDA can make a safety determination on average in 10 months or in 6 months for priority things like cancer or Alzheimer's drugs. We've seen regulatory reform in other U.S. agencies like FDA, and I think the recent cultural changes we've seen called for at the NRC are going to be critical if we're going to meet this objective.
I agree with that. If I could just jump in, we talked about the ADVANCE Act earlier, and we're incredibly thankful for that attention and focus on the ADVANCE Act because it sets out some pretty interesting frameworks. One of those was to say, hey, let's really drill into microreactors and the regulatory structure around microreactors. And so the ADVANCE Act lays that challenge out. And we are just submitting a paper to the NRC. It should be public probably in about a week, where today, if you were going to try to license a microreactor and follow that process, it's probably a 5-year process. And we submitted a paper and said, why isn't that 4 months? And here's how it could be 4 months. So will it get to be 4 months? I don't know. The point is, We're trying to really break the paradigm and say it doesn't need to be that. We have to think differently, and that's a great example of what he's talking about, which is there are new and different ways to think about this, and we need to do that.
Let me follow up on that with the, you're saying how we do it, the question of why we do it. Where should nuclear fit in the puzzle piece of the entire electric generation, both in the United States and abroad? I know it's like France loved it for a while, and then they didn't love it so much.
They love it again.
They love it again. Yeah.
Came back. So, I'm biased in this answer, so I'm going to just start there. I've been in the nuclear industry for almost 40 years. But we commissioned a study from Vibrant Clean Energy, and we just said, model the United States down to a pretty low level of detail. This model took several days to run on a computer, just to give you a view of how much they modeled the transmission and distribution sector to do this analysis. And we said, work on it for clean energy, and first of all, have problems and challenges and delays for nuclear. Let the model not select as much nuclear as it wants to select, and then run a case where it's easy to select nuclear, and then sort of see what the difference is. And that model came out, just running it as it is, the distribution for the best cost of electricity for our ratepayers, right, was 40% nuclear. 40% nuclear. And the price when you were not choosing nuclear and you went heavier on other technology, and I love all the technologies, okay? But I do love nuclear the best. But when you look at all the different technologies, you gotta watch what you're building, right? Because some of that needs more transmission and distribution. So you gotta be real careful. Don't just analyze generation, because you as a ratepayer are not just paying for generation, you're paying for generation and transmission and distribution. So you gotta solve for the whole thing. That's why when you add nuclear, the system cost goes down. There was another study in the Pacific Northwest that was done. E3 did that one. And they tried to decarbonize everything with wind and solar, and then they did wind, solar, and nuclear. And the cost when you added nuclear to that solution, $8 billion with a B dollars a year savings to those ratepayers, $8 billion. And why is that? It's because nuclear puts out more energy in one place, round the clock, 7 days a week, very reliable. So it's less transmission and distribution that you need, as opposed to a lot of little things in a lot of places, but they all need wires going to them. Right? So really we have to look holistically at this system. We are fundamentally changing this system over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Don't figure it out 30 years from now what we should have done. Figuring out today what we should do so we spend our money wisely on infrastructure, and we are the kindest that we can be to our ratepayers and to the price of electricity.
So saving $8 billion sounds great, I think, and as we've discussed, there's political support, there's popular support for nuclear, but as with every utility on the face of the planet, Leslie, there is a lot of NIMBYism. Nobody wants to live, in Springfield of the Simpsons, under that shadow. There are some ways to address that, right? That is being addressed.
Sure, and to go back to the point around kind of what's the regulatory oversight look like in the United States for nuclear energy, and around the ADVANCE Act and the need to speed up the process, this is not about cutting corners for the industry. It's not about, creating a process that isn't diligent. And so I really want to address that, because I think a lot of folks kind of maybe have a misconception around the kind of, relationship between speeding up a process and perhaps not doing as much due diligence as is necessary. And so I think we can do both of those things. We have a lot of, engineering knowledge and safety kind of history in this country that we're building on in order to tweak these regulatory processes in order to speed up the things. And so I think, we want to be sure that we are pushing the envelope on nuclear power without necessarily, being less diligent than we have in the past. And so I think around NIMBYism, so the point around, who wants to live around any energy facility is a good one, because there's a lot of questions around like lawsuits and regulatory reform. This is a great week to be having this conversation because there's a huge new permitting reform bill out, right? The Senate Energy Committee just passed it on a bipartisan vote. Another bingo card for bipartisan. So the question around, how do we speed up the process for building any, energy infrastructure around this country is really important, and that includes the really critical point that Maria was making around transmission. And so I think that the conversation in the popular view of how we move forward as a country and really address our climate goals through the development of new energy infrastructure, as well as rebuilding in this country domestic supply chains for energy infrastructure, and building on the legacy of U.S. innovation, especially in nuclear energy. These are the questions that we have to grapple with, and so there are efforts, I think, around the country to have more conversations at that community level around what types of energy facilities are needed, and how do we make sure that we have processes in place to roll those out in a way that takes into consideration the community concerns.
I would just add, really what we're seeing now, we had bills from 20 different states passed last year alone, 20 different states pulling nuclear to their state. Okay, so it really isn't so much the conversation that we had back in the 70s and 80s anymore. You have governors that are coming out and saying, I want nuclear. The Virginia governor, the Tennessee governor, the Wyoming governor, just to name a few, right? And so, it's a real different climate. Not only do we have bipartisanship at the federal level, you have at the state level a real pull, and they know it because they say whoever gets clean energy right in their state, they win in the long term, because they have companies that want to invest in them, and they're doing right by their constituents. So it's a very unique opportunity, and I would say it's not just the United States, it's happening around the world. The signature at the Conference of the Party at the end of last year, worldwide to triple nuclear. That's amazing. This is a fundamental shift. We are in a fundamental shift, and we have to leverage it.
Let's take a question from the audience.
This one comes from Matthew, who's a safety manager. How can we implement preventive maintenance, safety, and security for all?
Has that changed fundamentally? I mean, you were just saying this is not the nuclear of the 70s.
Yeah, honestly, we do implement preventive measures. So I spent 30 years of my career operating nuclear power plants. I was a site vice president and ran one, and I was a chief nuclear officer, and I ran 5 at 3 different locations. Preventive maintenance is just a part of what we do. It's built in. It will currently do that, and as we go ahead, we get smarter and smarter and smarter at it. But that's one of the reasons these assets run 80 plus years, and there's nothing magic about 80, maybe 100 years. It's because we take such good care of these assets. When I went to the Gannett plant, it was 40 years old, and if I would have taken you on a tour of that plant, I would have told you it's a teenager. So you don't measure these plants in years, you measure them on how well they're taken care of, and they're very well cared for.
And one more from the audience.
Sure, this one comes from Patrick Kilbride. What are some of the key legal and regulatory barriers to broader adoption of nuclear power generation?
Yeah, I guess we've touched on that, but like, what is, if you could get rid of anything in the books, where would you start? And we're nearing the end of the show, so that's probably where we're gonna end. I think for everyone. Yeah.
I don't know if everybody wants to take a stab at that. I'll just frame it out again. We have a fantastic fleet of today, and so I think we just need to continue the hard work that we do each and every day to get that high reliability factor that we have had for over 20 years, a greater than 90% capacity factor of our current fleet. And in this future fleet, we simply got to get to build, and I don't think it's legal challenges and regulatory challenges. I think it's de-risking the front-end financing so we can just get moving. It's maybe a lot less complicated than people think. It's a financial de-risking, and we need to get moving.
And I think we're seeing a lot of alignment start to happen, right? We have the need for more electricity in this country, so there's more recognition that we need to move quickly on clean electricity technologies. And then there's the piece around the financial incentives that the government has under consideration that have been, part of the past suite of federal laws that have been passed, and how do we, build on some of the programs that the Department of Energy and others have to invest in this and help to de-risk. And then how can we build on that and make sure that when a utility comes with its integrated resource planning process, or other entities are looking at the deployment of nuclear, they can understand and evaluate and know that nuclear is part of the puzzle that they're going to have to unlock to be able to transition their electricity.
And well, to end, Stephen, I guess we've talked a lot about the competition, sort of unfriendly competition between the U.S. and China here. Maria, you mentioned a bit of the collaboration globally. On a global scale, Stephen, what can or would need to happen for, say, the United States and the EU to help each other out?
Well, I once did a study looking at the deployment of intelligent transportation systems. And it took our Department of Transportation 5 years to study even the possibility of deploying a national system that Japan went ahead and did within 5 years. So I think there are things we can do in coordination with allied governments. I think the NRC is looking with the Canadians on licensing from the fourth generation reactors. So let's work together with the regulators to have coherent licensing and regulatory schemes. Let's co-invest in R&D, particularly on nuclear fusion with our allied countries. And let's recognize that a nuclear reactor or something in the supply chain deployed by an allied country as opposed to a geostrategic competitor is a win for our collective economies.
Well, on that happy note, I think we should wrap this up. But please thank our great panel.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thanks to all of our wonderful speakers this morning. On behalf of the Hill and our sponsor, the Nuclear Company, we'd like to thank everyone who joined us here in person and those of you who tuned in online. If you missed any portion of today's discussion, the full event video is available on our website, thehill.com. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.